to be different, called to be changed. So God, make us different, make us change so we can shine in the darkest places, shine so they can see your face, shine and experience your amazing grace. So let us shine.
As Todd alluded to, I am not McKenna. McKenna and Cameron got stuck in the heavy snow and made the wise decision not to travel. Today, though, I'm going to talk about a group that was not able to make that decision. Psalms 18:17 through 19 says, "He saved me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into an open place and rescued me because he delighted in me." And if you go back and look at this later, you'll see how this really applies to this overall story that I'm going to be talking about today. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded the lightly defended South Korea with infantry, tanks, and artillery, nearly taking the entire country. South Korea had no defenses for this. They had no tanks, no anti-tank weapons, no heavy artillery. So a coalition of UN member nations led by the United States intervened. And I'm very thankful that they did. Since my late wife was South Korean, my son therefore comes from half from that genetic pool, I wouldn't have him without the intervention by the UN forces, I really doubt, because I don't think there would have been adoptions from South Korea later. So I got a personal connection to this story. So after weeks of bitter fighting, North Korean forces were pushed back over the border at the 38th parallel. In response, China sent a 1 million-man army against the Allies. And according to interviews, it wasn't just China, there was also Russian planes involved because they found Russian downed pilots, though that is not in the history books. By November 26, 10,000 men of the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of 2 Army regimental combat teams, a detachment of British Royal Marine Commandos, and some South Korean policemen, were completely surrounded by over 10 divisions of Chinese troops in the rugged mountains of the Chosin Reservoir. So 10,000 Allied troops. And this happened right around this time frame. So over Thanksgiving, many of these men were given Thanksgiving turkey dinners that had been previously provided. And they got to enjoy them before the fighting started, but they knew they were surrounded and they knew they were in trouble. But in interviews, they said even though they didn't know how they were going to survive what was coming, the Christians among them still gave thanks to God for the Thanksgiving dinner they had, for the lives that they had previously led, for the people that they had been able to help up until this point. And if God was going to provide a miracle, they were praying ahead of time, thanks for that miracle. In John 11:41 through 43, Jesus gives thanks to God before Lazarus was raised from the dead for the miracle that would happen. And they didn't know if there was going to be a miracle or not, but they were thanking God in case there was going to be one, but if not, for the lives that God had already provided for them. So Chinese Chairman Mao himself ordered the Marines wiped out. Chinese General Song Si-lun threw waves of 120,000 soldiers each against the heavily outnumbered Allied forces. And if you can think what's going on around us, but magnify it, a massive cold front blew in to Korea, causing the coldest winter in recorded history. For the encircled Allies, daytime temperatures averaged 5 degrees below zero, nights plunged to at least 35 degrees below, and sometimes went down to 52 degrees below, and that's Fahrenheit. Jeep batteries froze and split, rations ran dangerously low, and the cans of food that they did have froze solid, and they couldn't get it out because they couldn't spare fuel to thaw those cans. If the truck engine stopped, their fuel lines froze. Automatic weapons quit cycling due to the cold. Morphine had to be thawed in medical personnel's mouth before they could inject it into patients. Bottles of blood plasma were frozen and useless, had to be thrown out. Resupply could only come by the air, and because of the weather, that wasn't happening. High command, in documentation later gotten through the Freedom of Information Act, had actually written them off, believing that they were hopeless and there wasn't anything that could be done. Washington braced for imminent news of slaughter and defeat and were already preparing their press releases. Retreat for these troops was not an option. Through the walls of Chinese troops, if the Marines tried to only hold their position, they would also be wiped out. So instead, they formed a 12-mile-long column, and they attacked. 78 miles of narrow, crumbling, steeply angled road, and 100,000 Chinese soldiers between the Marines and the sea at Hungam, where they could be rescued. Both sides fought savagely for every inch. The march out became one atrocious moving battle. The Chinese used the ravines between ridges, protected from rifle fire, to marshal their forces between attacks. The Marines' 60-millimeter mortars, capable of delivering high, arcing fire over the ridge lines, breaking up those waves of Chinese soldiers, became one of their most valuable weapons, but their supply of mortar rounds was being quickly depleted. Emergency requests for resupply were sent by radio using code words for specific items. They didn't want the Chinese troops to know what they were short on. So imagine all the prayers from these Marines being sent up for delivery and resupply. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and pleading with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." We know they started the battle by giving thanks for their meal and whatever God was willing to provide. And now they were also making their requests known by prayer. One Marine later said during an interview, it was looking pretty bleak. The planes couldn't fly and the Chinese were closing in. One night a cloud opened up and a Marine looked up in the sky and yelled, "Look, a star, a star." Then we knew that the planes would fly because the weather was breaking. Some Marines said they thought that star was placed there by God as a sign. Don't give up hope. I have not forsaken you. 1 Corinthians 4:8-9 says, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Desperate times. Many were praying for themselves, praying for their colleagues in arms, praying for deliverance, and praying for resupply. But sometimes we don't get what we ask for. Mark 5:21-42 says, "When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came, and upon seeing him fell at his feet and pleaded with him, earnestly saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, so that she will get well and live.' And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and endured much at the hands of many physicians had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but instead became worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, saying to herself, 'If I just touch his garments, I will get well.' And immediately the flow of her blood dried up. And she felt in her body that she had been healed of her disease. And immediately Jesus, perceiving himself that power had gone out, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?' And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. And the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be cured of your disease.'" Now think of it from the guy whose daughter needs to be healed, and Jesus is delaying. And he's getting worried because he knows things are desperate. While he was speaking, people came from the house of the synagogue official and said, Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher further?" But Jesus, overhearing what was spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Don't be afraid, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official and saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And after entering, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all outside, he took along the child's father and mother and his companions, and entered the room where the child was in bed. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translates means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately she got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astonished. Jairus had expectations about Jesus running to his house to save the day, probably at the last minute. But Jesus instead took much time, and she was already gone. Jairus and his family still got the miracle. It wasn't what they expected, but they still got it in another form. Just not the form they asked for. 2 Kings 5, 1 through 3 and 9 through 14. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man in the view of his master, and eminent because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but afflicted with leprosy. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife and said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, then he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the doorway of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean." He didn't even meet him personally. Naaman was furious, went away and said, "I thought he would certainly come out to see me, stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the site, and cure the leprosy." Are Abana and Parpar, the rivers of Damascus, not better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Then his servants approached and spoke to him, saying, "My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times in accordance with the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Naaman expected a show and a personal reception because he was an important person. Instead, he got instructions from a messenger and told to bathe in water that he didn't consider clean. He almost lost out due to his pride. But he still got his miracle healing, but it did not take the form he anticipated. And neither will it for the Marines at Chosin. Part 1, unexpected reinforcement. When you're surrounded by Chinese troops, would you expect reinforcement from a Marine First Lieutenant of Chinese ancestry? Lieutenant Lee was recovering in a field hospital from a gunshot wound to the arm he sustained during the early November fighting, and he heard about the Chinese offensive. Now, he wasn't just lightly wounded. They said his arm was kind of useless at the time, and the action that he was in, he got a Purple Heart for. So it wasn't nothing. But he was recovering. He heard about this. Instead of going, these poor guys, he left against medical orders, took a sergeant with him, also leaving against medical orders, who was recovering. They managed to enlist 500 Marines to come with them and managed to not only find the surrounded Allied forces, but to break through those enemy forces, link up with these people at Chosin, and provide a much-needed reinforcements, those 500 troops with ammo, with guns, and people that were fresh and ready to fight. Interviews by the troops that he brought in said it was a wonder this guy survived because he led from the front and not the front group. He was the first soldier attacking in pretty much everything that they had going on after that, because he knew he increased their chances if he was always at the front, because he would call out to these Chinese troops in Chinese, "No, we're part of your forces, don't shoot." And they would hesitate, so the Allied forces would get the drop on them again and again and again. Those people that he brought in later interviews said they would have followed him anywhere, the finest soldier that they ever worked with. Meanwhile, remember that the Marines' most urgent request had been for the mortar resupply to break up those waves of enemy soldiers. Through that unprecedented weather, the request was received, which was a slight miracle in itself due to the bad weather conditions. But due to the weather, the station that actually had the sheet to find out what the code word they sent in meant for resupply wasn't available. So the supply base knew they had a request for materials, but they couldn't decode them. So all this radio operator knew was that the request came with command authority, it was extremely urgent, desperate, and that the code word for what they wanted was Tootsie Roll. And there were tons of Tootsie Rolls at a supply base in Japan. So part 2, resupply. Tearing through the clouds and fog, parachutes bearing pallet loads of Tootsie Rolls descended on the Marines. Imagine the shock of the troops. Imagine the thoughts of all those that had prayed. What were the soldiers thinking when the supplies they urgently needed were not the ones they received? I'm wondering, were they thinking, have we prayed in vain? We need mortars and we cannot shoot Tootsie Rolls. Okay, to give you an idea of what they got, we have deep frozen these. So suck on them, thaw them in your hands or armpits or whatever, which is what the soldiers did. Do not chew them or you will break your teeth. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. Philippians 4:19a. God will supply all your needs. It doesn't say wants. You know, there's a lot of things that we want and on schedules that we want, but it doesn't say God will give us what we want. It says God will give us what we need. Isaiah 40:28 through 31. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives strength to the weary, and to the one who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. And we know those Allied forces still had a lot of walking to do. So after the initial shock wore off of, we got chocolate, frozen Tootsie Rolls were thawed in armpits, popped in mouths, and their sugar provided instant energy. So all of a sudden these troops that were beat down and weary had new energy. For some, it was the only thing they had eaten in days and would be the only thing they would eat as they finished their evacuation, providing strength to the weary, like Isaiah said. The troops also learned that they could use warmed-up Tootsie Rolls to plug bullet holes in fuel drums, gas cans, radiators, where they would freeze solid again, sealing the leaks. So they went from having a few working vehicles that were pulling other vehicles for the wounded, they aren't going to leave them behind, they're Marines, pushing some vehicles with wounded on them, to all of a sudden, they got almost all of those non-working vehicles working again. Think how much faster you can move if you've got each vehicle under its own power instead of pushing it, pulling it with other vehicles. Back to Philippians, God supplies our needs, not our wants. 15,000-man column suffered 3,000 killed in action, 6,000 wounded, and thousands of severe frostbite. Their last battle was December 11th, but they did reach the sea, demolishing several Chinese divisions in the process. A 193-ship armada assembled at the port and evacuated not only the UN troops, but also their heavy equipment and roughly a third of the Korean refugees, those willing to leave Korea. U.S. historians call it the greatest evacuation movement by sea in U.S. military history. So let's go to Paul for his take on answering our needs. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10 says, "Because of the extraordinary greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I delight in weakness, in insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties, in behalf of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul wanted to be healed. He thought he would be more effective that way. And we don't know what he was suffering from. Some people think maybe it was a lingering vision issue from when Jesus spoke to him on the road. Maybe he had an ankle issue that would really hinder him and all the walking he did. But we don't know. Doesn't really matter. Sometimes the answer is that we have what we already need. And the thing that we think is handicapping us is actually providing us focus and a better witness. Kind of hard to think of sometimes and realize. We've also got the story of Jonah. He was called to witness to Nineveh, but he was scared, so he took a boat in the opposite direction. The folks on the boat drew lots when a storm came up to see who was the cause, and the lots fell on Jonah. Jonah told them what he had done, and their only hope was to throw him overboard. Jonah might have tried to flee from God, but in this case, he didn't flee from his mistake. He owned up to it, said, "Throw me overboard, my life is done, but you can live." And I thought it was interesting that they tried not to throw him overboard. They didn't want to do that, so they kept trying to get to shore again and again and again, but they finally realized you can't fight God, and they threw Jonah overboard. And I'm pretty sure he was rescued in a way that he did not expect. Let's pick up in chapter 2, where Jonah was rescued and is still in the belly of the fish, or whatever sea creature it was. Jonah 2, 2 through 10, "I called out of distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I called out for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice. You threw me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current flowed about me. All your breakers and waves passed over me. I said, I have been cast out of your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again towards your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The deep flowed around me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I descended to the base of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you have brought my life from the pit. Lord my God, while I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayers came to you into your holy temple. Those who are followers of worthless idols abandon their faithfulness. But I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pray. Salvation is from the Lord." He knew he did wrong. He owned up to it. He was saved, not in a pleasant way, maybe surrounded in stomach acid. We don't exactly know what it was like in there. But he was still giving thanks to the Lord because the Lord saved him. And it was at this point after the prayer that he was spit out of the fish onto dry land. The world is difficult. We often know how we want God to rectify a situation, but we have to remember to give thanks even when the resolution is not what we expect, only what we need. Like Nathan with his healing, Jairus with his daughter not healed, but returned to life, Jonah in the belly of the fish, God provides their needs. Back to the Marines and the Allied forces, hundreds credit their very survival to Tootsie Rolls, the miracle from God. The surviving Marines call themselves the Frozen Chosin, from where they were located when all this happened, and it's also a play on words that you can pronounce it chosen, because they believe they were chosen by God to survive. But they also call themselves the Tootsie Roll Marines, to remember that miracle that they got, that was unexpected and not what they thought was a miracle at first, but now acknowledge. Earlier we talked about Naaman and how he was healed as he needed, but not how he wanted. And let's pick up the rest of that story, or a little bit more anyway. 2 Kings 5:15a. Then he returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him and said, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all earth except in Israel. Naaman gave thanks and credit to God for his healing of his needs, not once. Jesus gave thanks even before miracles. Paul gave thanks for his wants not being met after he found out it made him a more effective witness. Jonah gave thanks while still in the fish for his needs being met in an unexpected way. The Marine Christians gave thanks. They gave thanks before the battle started, eating their Thanksgiving dinners, and they also gave thanks after. Particularly like the interview with Marine Frank Torres. The North Koreans didn't kill me. The Chinese didn't kill me. I was one of those fortunate people that made it all the way through. They prayed hard for me. Believe you, all of my family and all of my relatives, I know that. I know they helped bring me through for sure. I absolutely should have been killed, but God had his hand in mine. Many survivors viewed the chocolate as a miracle, a sign from God that hope was still possible. It isn't what they wanted, but it turned out to be better. So remember to give thanks to God when he continues to meet our needs, whatever they are, even when they're not our wants. We're going to move into our offerings part here. So if those are helping with the offering, come forward. So today, I preached about the miracles that God provided that meet our needs, not always our wants. How he did not grant them what they wanted, but just as with us, God knew what they really needed and what would be most effective. As the song we sang earlier, Count Our Blessings, name them one by one, we can look at our lives and see many times where God met our needs. Sometimes as we would have liked, sometimes not, but we got what we needed anyway. Sometimes we can look back and we can see that was really better what God provided for us than what we could have even thought. The offering today is for giving back in thankfulness for what God has done for us, trying to help push some of those blessings forward to others that need it, at the Bible college, those that are hungry. 1 Chronicles 29:14 says, But who am I and who are my people that we should be permitted to give anything to you, God? Everything we have has already come from you, and we only give you what is yours already. Matthew 10:8 says, just as we have freely received, we should freely give. Let's pray. Thank you, God, that we could come here together today through this weather to meet together as a family of fellow believers in you and your Son. And we could remember all the blessings that you have given us in our lives, and also the blessings that you've given to our friends and family. And we are so thankful for all that you have given us and all you have provided for us. And we thank you that we've got this Sunday that we can give to meet the needs of others, to help those that are hungry, to help those going to our Bible college so we can provide more pastors for churches that need them. We just thank you that we even have the ability to give back some of what you have provided us with. In your Son's name, amen.
So let us shine in a world that needs your light, in a world that needs your light.